President Biden has just been meeting with his Finnish counterpart. They are now taking part in a news conference alongside each other. Let's listen in.
Afternoon. Excellent that we have this kind of a big hall in the castle. Plenty of you here. First of all, Joe, Mr. President, I want to thank you for visiting Finland. We have had possibilities of meeting each other quite often during the...
I like it here even better.
Yep. And by the way, first time we met also in Helsinki, I was the Speaker of Parliament when you visited.
I remember.
So we have had a lot of discussions during the last couple of years. I want to once again thank you for the strong support you have given all the time.
It's my honor.
The new era in Finnish security policy has begun, and you will be one of those who wrote it to history. I also want to thank you for the Vilnius meeting. It was very touching to feel the unity between allies, and I think it was greatly created by you. We had possibilities of discussing bilaterally today. I took up the negotiations of our defense cooperation agreement. We are going to continue our security discussion by that, and that is of vital importance to Finland. In the same time, also Sweden and Denmark are having similar discussions, and at the end it seems that all the 5 Nordic countries will have a bilateral agreement with USA. Technology is one of the key words for the future. There are elements like artificial intelligence, quantum technology, sky technology. All that is leading our way to the future, and we have to make sure that it's leading our way in a very secure way, and that demands responsibility of those who know how. And that is why it is very important to coordinate and cooperate with our knowledge and resources forward in this sector. We also had a discussion on our neighbor, and I think that we both share similar views. The war in Ukraine was also discussed. We both see that we will continue support to Ukraine, which is defending not only herself but also all the values we represent in the Western world. We also had a meeting with the Nordic family. It is a tradition which started during President Obama's time, and it has been a very valuable tool for us to get even better understand each other's. Security and technology were also discussed there, and a lot of time and thoughts were presented on environmental issues. So, once again, it has been great to have you here.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. It's been great to be here. Look, it's an honor to be with you and our other Nordic friends. We just finished, I would suggest, a very productive U.S. Nordic Leaders Summit on the heels of the historic NATO summit in Vilnius, and where Finland took its place at the table as our newest ally. We've always been friends, but the newest official ally member of NATO. And And I also want to thank Minister Christensen of Sweden, who will soon be joining NATO, and Prime Minister Støre of Norway. We've had a great relationship, and Fredriksson of Denmark, and the Minister Jacoba, daughter of Ireland. You can tell that's a Freudian slip. I'm thinking of home. The daughter of Iceland, and I want to say I think we've had a very productive summit. We discussed, Mr. President, where we stand at an inflection point in history, where the decisions we make now are going to determine the course of the history for the next 4, 5, 6 decades. And this week we affirmed how Finland and the United States together with allies and partners are working in lockstep to set us on a stronger, safer, and more secure path, not just for Europe, not just for NATO, but for the world. In Vilnius, NATO met with 31 nations for the first time. We showed the world that our alliance is more united than ever, and soon it'll be 32 allies, thanks to an agreement with Turkey to move Sweden's accession protocols forward. And as capable partners and committed democracies, both Finland and Sweden are going to add significantly to the strength, security, and unanimity of NATO. And with stronger NATO, it makes the entire world stronger. Mr. President, as your ally, we want the people of Finland to know the United States is committed to Finland, committed to NATO, and those commitments are rock solid. That we defend every inch of NATO territory, and that includes Finland, obviously. Second, over the past week, we reaffirmed our unwavering support for the brave people of Ukraine as they defend their country against Russia's brutal and inhumane attacks. Our allies and partners around the world understand that this fight is not only a fight for the future of Ukraine, it's about sovereignty, security, and freedom itself. I want you to think about what would happen if we didn't do anything. What is likely to happen in the rest of Europe if we did nothing? So this week, NATO's officially elevated our relationship with Ukraine. Allies also agreed to lift the membership action plan. It's usually required before you could be admitted from Ukraine. And it's created a path to membership for Ukraine as it continues to make progress on the necessary democratic and security reforms required of every NATO member. We also made clear to President Zelensky that we're not waiting for NATO membership to be finalized to commit to the long-term security of Ukraine. The leaders of the G7 together issued a new joint declaration of support for Ukraine, a declaration I was glad to see the Nordic nations immediately welcome and support it. It's going to launch a process open to any nation to negotiate bilateral security agreements with Ukraine until they're officially members of NATO. It will not only ensure that Ukraine can defend itself today, but it will deter future aggression as well with a capable force across land, air, and sea from their friends. And finally, at every stop and every summit on this trip, we focus on using the power of partnership to take on the challenges that matter most to the people's lives in our countries. In the United Kingdom, we brought together public, private, and philanthropic partners to discuss ways to unlock literally trillions of private dollars in finance to fight climate change. In Lithuania, NATO allies met, and the EU and our Indo-Pacific partners to continue advancing our work on terrorism, cyber threats, resilience, and so much more. And here in Finland, at our U.S. Nordic Leaders Summit, we reaffirmed our commitment to stand together, to power a clean energy transition, to preserve regional security, to promote democratic values, and to pioneer the technologies of the future, from quantum computing to advanced communication systems, so we did it together. Mr. President, at this critical moment in history, this inflection point, the world is watching to see, will we do the hard work that matters to forge a better future? Will we stand together? Will we stand with one another? Will we stay committed to our course? This week, Finland, the United States, and our allies and partners said a resounding, loud yes. Yes, we'll step up. Yes, we'll stand together. And yes, we'll keep working toward a stronger, safer, and more secure world. So, Mr. President, thank you again for having me here. As partners, friends, and allies, I look forward to our work together in the years ahead, and it's been a real pleasure getting to know you even better. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have time for questions.
Shall we start with Yle and Ida Tikka? You.
Finnish Public Broadcasting Service. My question is for Mr. President Biden. The political volatility of U.S. remains a big worry for European partners. Meanwhile, back in Washington, a bipartisan group of senators has repeatedly failed to pass through Senate a bill that would prevent the U.S. presidents in the future from withdrawing from NATO without Senate's approval. What actions?
Sorry, without what? I'm sorry? I didn't hear the last part of your question.
In Washington, a bipartisan group of senators has repeatedly failed to pass through Senate a law that would prevent future U.S. presidents from withdrawing from NATO without Senate's approval. What actions will you take to assure Finland that the U.S. will remain a reliable NATO partner for decades to come?
I absolutely guarantee it. There is no question. There's overwhelming support from the American people. There's overwhelming support from the members of the Congress, both House and Senate, and both parties, notwithstanding the fact there's some extreme elements of one party. We will stand together. The American people known since the end of World War II and the formation of NATO that our security rests in the unanimity among European and transatlantic partner, us. And so this is, no one can guarantee the future, but this is the best bet anyone could make.
And my second question on that note to Mr. President Niinistö, hearing this answer that no one can guarantee a future, are you worried that the political instability in the US will cause issues in the alliance in the future?
Let me be clear. I didn't say we couldn't guarantee the future. You can't tell me whether you're going to be able to go home tonight. No one can be sure what they're going to do. I'm saying as sure as anything can possibly be said about American foreign policy, we will stay connected to NATO. Connected to NATO, beginning, middle, and end. We're a transatlantic partnership. That's what I've said.
It seems that the President has answered your problems, but I have to tell you that during this process, I met approximately President many times, but I would say about 50 people from Congress and Senate. And I think the message was quite clear, quite united. And I have no reason to doubt about USA policies in the future.
Let me say one more thing. We learned a hard lesson. Peace and security in Europe is essential to U.S. security and peace. The idea that there could be conflict in Europe among our friends and us not engaged has never happened in modern history. That's why we're staying together.
Next question, President Biden.
Oh, I've called on somebody. I'm sorry. Wall Street Journal. Andrew?
Thank you, Mr. President. You've said that Ukraine shouldn't enter NATO until after the war is over. Are you concerned at all that those comments could motivate Putin to keep the war going or discourage him from entering peace negotiations? And is there a serious risk that this war could drag on for years? And do you see any path toward the war ending with Putin still in power?
First of all, no one can join NATO while a war is going on, where a NATO nation is being attacked, because that guarantees that we're in a war, and we're in a third world war. So that it's not about whether or not they should or shouldn't join. It's about when they can join, and they will join NATO. The issue of whether or not this is going to keep Putin from continuing to fight, the answer is Putin's already lost the war. Putin has a real problem. How does he move from here? What does he do? And so the idea that there's going to be what vehicle is used, he could end the war tomorrow. He could just say, I'm out. But what agreement is ultimately reached depends upon Putin. and what he decides to do. But there is no possibility of him winning the war in Ukraine. He's already lost that war. Imagine anyway, he's already lost that war.
Just on the question of a concern about going on for years, is there a possibility that there's a stalemate in this becoming?
I'm sorry?
The question of whether the war could go on for years, is there a possibility there's a stalemate and it can continue for quite some time?
Well, I don't think the war can go on for years for two reasons. Number one, I don't think that that Russia could maintain the war forever, number one, in terms of their resources and capacity. Number two, I think that there is going to be a circumstance where eventually President Putin is going to decide it's not in the interest of Russia, economically, politically, or otherwise, to continue this war. But I can't predict exactly how that happens. My hope is, and my expectation is, you'll see that Ukraine makes significant progress on their offensive, and that it generates a negotiated settlement somewhere along the line.
And I have a question for the Finnish president, but I would be remiss if I didn't raise my colleague Evan Gershkovich, who's been in prison for more than 100 days. I just wondered if you had an update on the process for trying to get him out of prison, and if you're serious about a prisoner exchange.
Oh, I'm serious about prisoner exchange. I'm serious about doing all we can to free Americans who are being illegally held in Russia or anywhere else for that matter. And that process is underway.
Do you envision the possibility of the U.S. having a permanent military base in Finland?
Like I told, we are discussing on GCA, the Defense Cooperation Agreement, and it has a lot of elements. They are still open, but we are open on negotiations, and I know that our counterpart is also very open. So let us see.
Next question goes to President Niinistö, please.
Yes, it's Helsingin Sanomat and Elina Väntönen.
Thank you, Mr. President. And my question is for Mr. President Biden.
Okay.
Or should I just say President Biden? You have repeatedly talked about Finlandization becoming NATOization of Finland. Now, based on
what nation?
You have repeatedly talked about Finlandization becoming NATOization of Finland. Based on your long experience, how does that change Finland's place in the world?
Well, first of all, the context in which I said that was the gentleman who occupies a seat on the other side of your border in Moscow said he wanted the Finlandization of NATO. I said it was more likely he's going to get the NATOization of Finland. That's the context in which that was said. And what was the second part of your question?
I asked, how has Finland's position in the world changed during this NATO membership process?
Finland's already a strong, vibrant nation. I think what Finland's joining NATO does, and Sweden as well, when the Nordic countries are all members of NATO, just makes the world safer. It significantly increases the prospect that there is less likely to be war. We're deadly earnest about the notion. We'll defend every single inch of NATO territory. And now we're on the way of getting to 32 NATO nations. That's a significant commitment. And so the likelihood of any nation voluntarily deciding they're going to attack one of the nations or Finland is highly unlikely. And so, but if it were to, they understand they're not just attacking Finland, they're attacking 31 other countries.
Next question, President Biden, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess it's Arlette, CNN.
Thank you, Mr. President. We've seen more disarray with Russian generals, most recently with the firing of a general who criticized the defense ministry, this following that rebellion by Prigozhin. Does this raise any new concerns about Putin potentially doing more drastic things regarding Ukraine, like nuclear weapons, or potentially against the U.S., like election interference?
Well, first of all, they're already interfered in American elections, so that would not be anything new. They did that last time they tried to. But with regard to, I don't think there's any real prospect, you never know, but of Putin using nuclear weapons. Not only has the West, but China and the rest of the world has said, don't go there. Don't go there. Number two. Number three, I think that determining what happens to Prigozhin, what happens to Vilnius, what happens when we discuss this in Vilnius is God only knows what he's likely to do. I'm not even sure, we're not even sure where he is and what relationship he has. If I were he, I'd be careful what I ate. I'd be keeping my eye on my menu. But all kidding aside, who knows? I don't know. I don't think any of us know for certain what the future of Prigozhin is in Russia. And so I don't know how to answer that question beyond that.
And if I could also ask you something about happening back home. You're seeing the GOP grappling with tying abortion rights to defense issues, including a block on military promotions by Senator Tuberville. What does this say about U.S. military readiness? And would you be willing to talk with Tuberville to try to work out some solution?
I'd be willing to talk to him if I thought there was any possibility of him changing this ridiculous position he has. He's jeopardizing U.S. security by what he's doing. I expect the Republican Party to stand up and do something about it. They've in their power to do that. The idea that we don't have a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the idea that we have all these promotions that are in abeyance right now, that we don't know what's going to happen, the idea that we're injecting into fundamental foreign policy decisions what in fact as a domestic social debate on social issues is bizarre. I don't ever recall that happening, ever. And it's just totally irresponsible in my view. And I just think that, I'm confident that the mainstream of the Republican Party no longer does not support what he's doing. But they got to stand up and be counted. That's how it ends.
And for President Niinistö, you've been working on fortifying the fence along the border between Finland and Russia. Is there anything that you're seeing recently that concerns you? And also, as a leader who shares a border with Russia, what more do you want to see done to deter Putin?
During the beginning of our application process, surely we had to make sure first trying to figure out every possible negative action we might meet and surely how we respond on that. And we were very careful on that work. So at the moment situation is quite calm. Hope it remains as such. But I just want to tell you that Finnish people do feel more secure at the moment. We have 80% of population supporting NATO membership and more than 80% who say that we will also protect our allies. That's the Finnish position.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference.
Thank you very much.
You've been watching a presidential news conference between American President Joe Biden and his Finnish counterpart. This, of course, comes with Finland now the newest member of NATO, and soon Sweden will be the newest member of NATO. President Biden saying it has been a productive Nordic summit and a historic NATO summit this week, adding that the NATO alliance is more united than ever.
Yeah, of course, this comes just after that NATO summit where there was much conversation about the possibility of Ukraine joining that alliance, which is not happening at this time. This was a separate meeting following that, the U.S. Nordic Summit, as it's called, with the Finnish president referring to this as the Nordic family meeting with President Biden. Let's bring in former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, and NBC News military analyst Colonel Jack Jacobs. They are both with us. Thank you both for being here and help us have a conversation out of this. So I'm going to start with you, Colonel Jack Jacobs. And I actually want to ask you something that was brought up here that is an interesting question, that was a question from a Wall Street Journal reporter to President Biden, which had to do with this question of Ukraine joining and what this potentially means as we look down the road for NATO here. He had asked, do you see Putin seeing the fact that Ukraine can't join NATO until this war ends as a potential that something could stay ongoing there? The president's answer was just Putin has already lost. But what do you make of that question and that thought?
Well, Putin doesn't need any motivation to keep the war going, and he will continue to do that. There's something of a military stalemate at the moment, even though there are local counterattacks down near Bakhmut and in the Donbass region. Both sides are going to have to commit substantial resources to change the military situation, and that's going to take some time. It'll take time to get more weapons to Ukraine, for them to be trained to use some of them for their employment and so on. Putin's got no motivation whatsoever to stop right away, no matter what the president says. The fact is he's going to keep going. The likelihood is that the war will drag on for some time unless they're on the ground. There is some substantial change to the military situation, which we don't see coming anytime soon. It's interesting to go back and think about something that the president said in the press conference, which was something of a mirror of something that Henry Kissinger said a long time ago when the war started, and that is that he expected the end of it is going to be some sort of negotiated settlement.
Let's bring in NBC News Chief White House correspondent Peter Alexander, who's actually in the room where the news conference took place. Peter, you've been traveling with the president all week long. What are the big headlines to come out of this news conference here and just everything we've witnessed this week?
What the president has said is that we cannot expand.
Well, I think, Joe, obviously this is a punctuation mark on what the White House is celebrating as a successful trip overseas with the expansion of NATO, celebrating its 31st member here in Finland, the likely addition in the not-too-distant future of Sweden after the path was cleared by Turkey that dropped its opposition. So that's what the president feels good about as he departs here. But there are a couple headlines that struck me here. Among others, the president was pressed on whether he could guarantee that the U.S., perhaps under a future Republican administration, if perhaps former President Trump is to become president again, would maintain its position in NATO. The president saying that he absolutely guarantees it. Of course, it's not something that the president can guarantee, but he did try to sort of assuage those fears of American allies, including those here in Finland, where they share an 830-mile border with Ukraine. I was struck that as we stand in this room, Joe, it's almost 5 years to the day after former President Trump stood here alongside Russian President Vladimir Putin, where President Trump at the time said he believed Vladimir Putin's denials about Russian election interference over the assessments of the American intelligence agencies. President Biden today, in one of his answers, saying, among other things, that the Russians are already interfering in U.S. elections. So there was certainly a contrast there. The president said he didn't think this war could go on for years, indicating that Russia couldn't keep it up for that long. But it is a real concern, as President Biden recently acknowledged, that one of the reasons the U.S. is sending these cluster munitions that are prohibited, that are banned by more than 120 countries to Ukraine right now, is because not only are the Ukrainians running low on ammunition, but the U.S. does not have enough ammunition to provide them right now. So real questions about the supply chain as well. A couple other things that we've been focusing on as we've been listening to the president are what the president said as it relates to the future, not just for the U.S. and its relationship with Russia, but also what his concerns are about what we've been seeing back at home, specifically about the efforts by the conservative Republican senator from Alabama, Tommy Tuberville, who has basically said that he would not support the passing or the confirmation of any military generals. The Joint Chiefs of Staff is not without a permanent head right now because, as he said, Tuberville is jeopardizing U.S. security at this time. He called it irresponsible. So that was some tough language from President Biden as well on that topic. But as the president prepares to head home, he is certainly, Joe, as we noted, celebrating the successes, the fortifying of NATO here, even as Ukraine leaves here without the membership that it was hoping for, or even the timeline it was hoping for its membership. The president saying that that can't happen until after the war, because if Joe and Savannah were to happen now, that would effectively put the U.S. at war with Russia.
Let's also now, Peter, thank you very much for that recap, and stay with us if you don't mind. Let's bring in, though, Ambassador Bill Taylor, who I believe we do still have and want to get a question to here. If you could just put in context for us, Ambassador, of course, I know you are the ambassador to Ukraine, but obviously have a knowledge of relations with this whole region. I mean, just a reminder here, the reason that so much news is coming out of this is because 2 new countries are joining the NATO alliance. Remind us of the relationship prior with Finland. I know at least up until recently, relations have been fairly cordial between Finland and Moscow. So walk us through kind of the impact this has, them actually deciding to join this alliance.
Well, Savannah, you're exactly right. The focus here the last couple of days has been on Ukraine, and it's that relationship. It's the Russian invasion of Ukraine that struck the Finns and the Swedes as in a way that they hadn't been struck before. That is, they didn't believe until the invasion happened on the 24th of February, 2022, that Russia would invade. And when these 2 neutral nations saw what could happen to a nation that was defenseless in terms of nuclear weapons, had much smaller weapons. When they saw that, they knew, the Finns and the Swedes knew, that they needed some support. They needed to join the NATO alliance if they were going to be secure. And so that led then to this summit. But again, it's the focus on Ukraine and the need for Ukraine to win this war that is going to allow them to join NATO after the Swedes and the Finns.
Ambassador Taylor, that news conference there shows that there's clearly concern around the world that not right now, but maybe someday in the future, America might not be as interested in NATO. How realistic is that fear?
It's a fear, Joe. There's no doubt that people are worried about it. I get the same question. I was in Ukraine. I was in Kyiv in May. I'll be there again in 2 weeks. I know that that's the question I'm going to get over and over. And my answer, frankly, is the same as President Biden just gave. That is, there's strong bipartisan support up until now. There looks like there will be continued strong bipartisan among the American people. The polls show 2/3 of 65% of the Americans support the weapons to Ukraine and support the defeat of Russia. So there's strong bipartisan support. That will continue. I am convinced.
And Peter Alexander, if we still have you with us, let's bring you back in here and just kind of remind us, we're talking about this potential as NATO continues to expand. I'm not sure if Peter can actually still hear me. It doesn't look like he can. So Ambassador Taylor, let me come back to you and just kind of remind us what we've heard so far this week from the positioning of Ukraine potentially joining. We know, we all know the headlines here that it's not until after the war, but walk us through, what that potential 3rd edition here, sometime potentially in the near future, what that looks like as NATO continues to expand.
Well, Savannah, you're right. There are two time frames here. The first is immediate, and the immediate weapons to Ukraine. Strong support from NATO, strong announcements of new weapons coming to Ukraine from the Brits and the French and the Nordics, the strong security guarantees from the G7, the bilateral within the G7 with Ukraine. So that immediate support is there. And then, as you point out, there's a long-term commitment. And the G7 made that clear as well, that they're supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes for victory. Now, if there is victory this year, which is possible, I know the colonel thinks it's not, but it is possible this year that the Ukrainians could push the Russians out. And if that happens, then what NATO has decided is it will be very quick for Ukraine to be able to join the alliance.
Peter, heading into all the summits this week, there are all these questions over the controversy of America and the cluster bombs. How big of an issue did that end up being, either openly or behind closed doors, throughout all the meetings that took place this week?
Well, the White House, as you speak to officials here privately, say that they didn't really get any pushback privately on that specific issue from their allies. Recognize that all of Western Europe, most of the NATO leaders do oppose the use of cluster munitions. Even a couple of years ago, when it was there was discussion about the potential that Russia would use those cluster munitions, which are viewed as a problem because they can not all detonate at once, which means that some detonate later on the battlefield where they could be picked up by children or civilians, so they can pose a threat to civilians. The White House in the past had said that it could be viewed, when used by the Russians, as a war crime. So how is it not a war crime if the U.S. is to use them as well? The president has insisted that this is a necessary but difficult choice at the White House that the president has had to make because the Ukrainians are running low on ammunition right now. Notably, Volodymyr Zelensky, as he spoke about this yesterday, said that the Ukrainians need those cluster munitions, those cluster bombs, because it helps save us, to use his language. He said, among other things, that he didn't hear the complaints from other countries when Russia began using them in Ukraine. But it is certainly an interesting topic, and it does sort of reveal some of the divisions that still do exist under the surface here among these NATO allies as it relates to that issue, and frankly, the issue of whether Ukraine should be allowed into NATO right now. Those countries that are closer in the Eastern Bloc, including Lithuania, a former Soviet state, they are more inclined to say, let Ukraine in now. They worry about their own future, what Russia might do next. But some of the other countries, including Poland, Germany, and the United States, have said it can't happen yet.
Peter, I also want to ask you about something that the president was asked about by the Wall Street Journal reporter asking about his colleague, Evan Gershkovich. We heard a little bit here just from my notes I have. Essentially, the president responding to a question that was, are you serious about the potential of a prisoner exchange? And Biden said, yes, we are serious about this prisoner exchange, and also mentioned the process is underway. What do we know about that?
Well, he didn't reveal any more details about where that back and forth stands with the Russians about their effort to get back the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. It's now been more than 100 days that he has been held there. Obviously, if past is precedent, there could at some point be some form of a prisoner exchange. You remember that's how Brittany Griner, the WNBA superstar, was able to come home a matter of months ago. But the president did try to reaffirm his commitment to getting Gershkovich and other U.S. hostages, prisoners, back home, but do recognize this is a real challenge, the one the administration is focused on, but one that is also dissatisfying to so many, including the Gershkovich family, that wants their son, their loved one, home.
Right. Peter Alexander, our chief White House correspondent, reporting from Finland, along with former Ambassador Bill Taylor and Colonel Jack Jacobs. We thank you all for your perspective as we break down this news conference between the American president and his Finnish counterpart, coming to an end, a huge international week when it comes to diplomacy, when it comes to discussions about what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, as one of our guests said, sort of a punctuation mark here at the end, seeing those two together, of course, with one of the newest